Good morning, Central. As Pastor Jeremy mentioned, my name's Ray Almstead. If you don't know me, I'm on staff here at Central as a communications director, but also has been a part of the preaching team, and this is my final farewell to Central. It's my last sermon, and I'm going to try to keep it brief, but Pastor Jeremy said just have at it, so you can blame him if I go long, okay? No, it's a bittersweet thing because this is a time where I feel like God is calling me on to some other things, and I feel like God is moving Central in a direction, and I'm both excited and anticipating what all of that means, but it also means transition, and that things will be different. And so before I actually dive into my sermon today, I have for you, Central, 10 challenges I would like to present, and less of a challenge and more of an encouragement. Some of this is already who you already are, but as a final parting word to you, Central, I would just like to encourage some of the things that I've seen and been a part of, and also lean into that challenge a little bit. The first challenge that I have for you, Central, is stay central. Keep being central. Central, you've allowed me to come into this space as a rigid, formerly Pentecostal cult member, and be myself. You've let me be who I am. You've let me work things out within myself, and I've never felt pressure to be anyone but who I am, and I appreciate that about you. Keep that, preserve that. I know that I'm not the only person that would reflect that about Central. I've heard many other stories from many other people who would say this has been a place where they could just be who they are. So stay being Central. 2, stay curious. You've probably heard this in my sermon frequently and often as I've encouraged us to, be curious about what's going on in other people's lives and avoid drawing conclusions and making assumptions, because assumptions close the door, but curiosity opens the door. And the end of curiosity is the end of learning. And so no matter what it is, it could be somebody who looks different than you, acts different than you. It could be some decision that's being made that you don't fully understand. Stay curious, move towards curiosity and learning. Seek to understand before seeking to be understood. Number 3, support the staff. I love this team. I have been privileged to be a part of our staff team. I will tell you from firsthand experience, every single one of our staff members work more than what they're being paid to do. They're a faithful team. They're an amazing team. And yes, thank you. I've gotten notes from you. I told Pastor Jeremy when he was here and he preached the first time, I said, you got like 15 emails, didn't you? Every time I've preached, I've got emails from you just thanking me. I've got notes in my boxes thanking me for what I've done. During COVID, those of you who had seen what was happening behind the scenes, you are a thoughtful congregation. You pick up what's happening and you communicate that. Continue to do that, but don't assume that somebody else is taking care of it. If you see a staff member who's doing something, just write about it. Drop a note in their box. Send them an email. It means so much. It's meant so much to me, and I know it means so much to them. And I know as we embrace our new pastor, Pastor Jeremy and Sarah, their whole family has moved across this country. And what an investment to make that kind of move and be here. Just love on them, support them, encourage the vision that they're bringing to the church, and support them as much as you can. Number 4, invest before criticizing. And this is actually something that through Central, I just kind of wrote it down somewhere as reflect on what you've contributed before you offer criticism. In the actual world, that we live in, if you try to withdraw from an account that you haven't invested, they call that robbery. And in your own account, if you try to withdraw where you haven't invested, there are penalties. And when you think about something that you don't like or something that you don't care for, think first, how am I invested? And I think that goes to relationships. I think that goes to the church. I think that goes to how we serve. But think about investing before criticizing. Number 5, read the Friday email. I once, there was a congregation member who had a great sense of humor. One time when we were doing the community celebration, we were transitioning from the annual meeting to the community celebration. She comes to me and she's like, I didn't know that was happening. And I was like, really? I was like, it's been on the website for 6 weeks. And she's like, oh, I don't go to the website. I was like, oh, okay. I was like, but it was also in the bulletin for 6 weeks. And they're like, I never get that. And I said, well, it was also in the Friday email. She's like, oh, I never opened that. And I just looked at her and she realized what was happening. And I was like, oh, you must have missed the singing telegram that we sent to your house. She laughed. And there was a moment of jest and she's like, okay, I'm going to read the email. I say this not because, partly I'm a communications director, right? So I have a bias towards it, but also because we live in a world that's plying for our attention. And no matter where you go, what you're involved with, your gym, your church, whatever, we are in an attention deficit. There's not a communications problem. There's an attention problem. So just read the Friday email, maybe unsubscribe from some of those things you don't want to pay attention to, and you'll know what's going on here at Central. Number 6, be comfortable with being uncomfortable. Be comfortable with discomfort. Tension equals growth. I had a mentor that told me, take anything off the shelf of life that you want, just pay for it. And oftentimes, it's very easy for us to get excited about a new vision or a new direction or something we want to do or something we want to experience. But sometimes when it comes time to pay the price, we shy away from it and we lack courage. But Central, we are here today because those before us embraced the tension and the discomfort of sacrifice. This literal building is built because people saw a vision for people who weren't yet a part of the congregation about creating a space. Keep doing that. Keep staying comfortable with discomfort. Number 7, make room for others. This is what you do already. But always be willing to give up your seat, a preference, an idea, a certain way that you like things so that somebody could meet Jesus. Craig Rochelle says, I will do anything short of sin so that someone would know Jesus. Maybe that's a little far than we're willing to go, but always be willing to sacrifice your seat at the table so that someone else can have a seat at the table. This means thinking about the outsider always. Never forget that there are people in this room that don't understand the language. I remember when I came here for the first time and it all got quiet during confession. That was something I'd never been a part of. I was like, what's happening? What's going on? There's always someone in the room who don't quite understand what we might understand, and think about them. Number 8, keep thinking about the next generation. Again, we're here today because somebody thought about the next generation. And the next generation will always be changing and will always be weird to the previous generation. There's all kinds of language and and all of that kind of stuff that happens that we don't get and we don't understand, but always think about the next generation and help them to have a seat at the table. Number 9, and probably one of the most important ones that I will say, is Pastor Jeremy will never contact you via text or email to buy gift cards. Those of you who aren't aware of this, we have a running scam ever since Pastor Jeremy showed up. I don't know if his kids are playing pranks on us or what, no. But he's not going to contact you for gift cards. Don't respond. It's okay. And number 10, the final one, which leads into my sermon, listen for God's voice. And this is something that you do carefully. Central is not a fast mover. It's not a reactionary mover. And that's partly because you pause and listen for the voice of God and the direction He's taking us. Trust His direction, even when it's difficult and unclear. And that leads me to this sermon. Today, we've been in a series called Life with God, and we're talking about attributes of prayer, dynamics of prayer, and what they mean. And today, we're going to talk about listening for God's voice. Listening prayer and listening to God's voice is possibly what I would argue one of the most important attributes of prayer. Because when we speak, we're trying to make an impact, but when we listen, we're trying to be impacted. And as long as we're speaking and as long as we're sharing, and we're not pausing to be impacted, how does God's will enter our hearts and enter our minds? There's a few scriptures I'm going to refer to throughout this talk, and I just want to read them up front, and then I'm going to refer to them throughout the sermon. But Psalms 37-4, take delight in the Lord, and he will give you the desires of your heart. Then Proverbs 3:5-6, trust in the Lord with all of your heart, lean not to your own understanding, in all your ways submit to him, and he will make your paths straight. And Romans 8:28, and we will know that in all things God works for the good of those who love him, who have been called according to his purpose. These verses remind us that God doesn't just answer our prayers, but in our prayers he reshapes us. He reshapes our hearts, our minds, and our paths and our direction into a direction that follows his will. He transforms our understanding. He orders our steps when we pause to listen. And I'm here today, and I'm actually leaving from here today because of that journey myself. In 2007, I was feeling some kind of sense of stirring in the congregation, in the church that I was in. I was raised in this church my entire life. It's all I ever knew. I went to a college within the denomination of the church I was raised in. It's really all I knew. We didn't have a habit of reading books outside of our denomination. I was very isolated with a certain doctrine and ideology. And I didn't feel God necessarily leading me out of that, but I knew that he was doing something in my life. And so I took a personal retreat to Gettysburg, and I got a hotel, and I spent time journaling and trying to listen where God might be leading. After that trip, I walked away feeling very clear that God was calling me to start a church. And I knew that this was going to be a church that was different than what maybe I had experienced. And as the years went by, as we entered into 2008, or as the months went by, entered into 2008, I kept feeling like this sort of angst and disruption internally. And I knew, like, I don't know that God wants me to transplant exactly what I have here to another community. I think he wants me to do something different. What's hard about that is I was a part of a denomination that was very rigid. I will just speak from my personal point of view without trying to label anyone from there, but I was very dogmatic. Some of you have said, I can't imagine that. I was. Some of my family here knows I was. I was dogmatic. I defended the doctrine. I was a zealot. I would have lunches with people who were leaving, and I would tell them how wrong they were, and I would confront and all speak the truth in love, and it would end up being this like tension. And I can remember actually praying prayers after these lunches, these intense luncheons, and I would say, Jesus, I believe I'm doing the right thing. But when you came to this earth, the people who were supposed to know you the best did not recognize you when you were right in front. And I would say, please, God, don't let me miss you. And I would repeat that prayer over and over and again. There are moments, me standing in my house, where I can remember, God, don't let me miss you. Don't let me miss you. Don't let me miss you. I began to wrestle with the responsibility of leading a church and what it meant to actually get help people to know Jesus. And I felt a sensitivity towards those who would never step their feet inside the doors of a church. And I started to think about how we could create a way for atheists and agnostics and people who are hurt by the church to ultimately know Jesus. Very excited, but as I started kind of space, it didn't go over well. And by the end of 2008, by December of 2008, that relationship had completely unraveled. And actually, when I think about it, this is actually the first church that's sending me off. The last one I got kicked out. So thank you for that. But they asked us to leave, and we left. And I remember just being crushed. I've lost my brother tragically. I've lost my brother-in-law tragically. I've lost my dad, and I can't tell you how painful that experience was. That was by far the most painful experience I've ever gone through. As I watched all of these relationships and friendships and people that I knew begin to unravel around me, this community that I grew up in, I was raised in, I watched it just vanish and disappear in front of my face. And it crushed me. It literally crushed me. We were not only losing our job, we were losing our identity, we were losing our community, and just all sense of hope about where life would go. And if you remember where we were financially in this country in 2008, my wife and me both, losing our job was not a good picture. But yet beneath this pain was this odd feeling where Proverbs 3 and 5 became more than words. It became a lifeline. Trust in the Lord with all your heart. Lean not to your own understanding. Don't lean to don't look around, because that's not going to give you any hope. Lean not to your own understanding, but in all your ways, surrender to him, and he will make your path straight. So we decided, I told my wife, I was like, this is a lot. Let's just get away. Let's go to Whitetail and go skiing. And at that point, my sister-in-law, Shiloh, and her kids were very young, and my sister-in-law, April, and her son, Aiden, were very young, and we went to Whitetail just to get away. This was December 26, 2008. Remember that date? We'll come back to it. We go skiing, and it was just a nice break, and ultimately we felt this unlogical sense of peace in the midst of the storm of our life, where Romans 8:28 whispered into our ears and whispered into our uncertainty that we know that all things work together for good to those who love him and who are called according to his purpose. Even in this moment of profound loss, God was weaving a story more beautiful than I could ever understand or know. We would then go on, and God would do a lot of things in our hearts and our life. We would start a church, which ultimately gave me space to deconstruct my faith and figure out what was the main thing. He dropped someone in my life that was a coach that walked me through this entire process. And during the church plant, I was planting a church. I was, running a business. And Linda, you're here. I was on several boards in our community. There was like 3 boards I was on. I was tired. I was worn out. I was exhausted. And Erin Donovan, a member here at the church, actually, I'd done some work for her, and she's like, hey, Central's needing a communications person. Do you think you could help fill the gap? And I was like, sure, I'll go fill the gap. Well, I came into the doors of this building not knowing what kind of story was going to unfold for me. Ultimately, Jim asked if I would do a couple little projects here and there, and I was taking on little projects, and I helped get signage throughout the building and all this kind of stuff. But every day when I came in, I would meet Linda Free and Gail Shank, and we would have a conversation, and I would go back into my office, and then I would meet various other ones. And I remember having a moment because I'm trying to carry all these things forward. And I was exhausted and tired. And I remember that just little touch from them. It reminded me what it was like to be cared about. And I'm not saying that there weren't people in my life that cared about me. I just felt like I was carrying this load and pushing and pushing and pushing, but I forgot what partnership felt like. I forgot what it was like to be in an office with people. I was going to my basement every day and like trying to motivate myself to do work. And then over time, I would end up, it would be 10 more hours and 10 more hours, and then ultimately a full-time position here at Central, and ultimately felt to close the doors of our church congregation and merge it with another congregation, and it came on staff here full-time. And during that time, I got to meet so many more of friends, Mandy and Amy, and Matt and Joe welcomed me to the staff with a Nerf gun firing squad. That was different. But I got to see what it was like to sit under Pastor John and what it was like to serve under a humble leader. And God began to heal my heart from the bruises and the pain that I experienced prior. I got to feel like what it was like to be a part of a congregation that was thinking through vision and created grace and space for people from all different walks of life. I got to meet a good friend, Andy, who invited me to this pastor's retreat that I still go to now. This will be my 7th year, this Pastor's Covenant group. And those guys invested in me, and those guys have been a place for me to just share my heart and my pain, and they walked with me through the loss of my dad and through other transitions in life, and have prayed with me and walked with me. All a part of this intersection, this hub called Central, these paths lead out of. And I say this all because I was clueless. I had no idea. It wasn't like God laid out a contract and he's like, okay, here's what you're going to do. And I signed up for it. I think ultimately I was just trying to listen for his voice and take the time to know, like, is this where you're leading me? There's a story that I think of, the story of Joshua, as God was talking to Joshua. They had been in the wilderness for 40 years. They had been kind of, waiting on God. And God spoke to Joshua one day and he's like, look, I'm going to take you on to the next thing. I'm going to take you on to something else. And he tells Joshua, I want you to go to the Jordan River. I'm going to take you to the Jordan River. And when you put your feet in the water, he's going to spread the waters. All right, and we'll pick this up in Joshua 3, verse 14 through 17. He says, so when the people broke camp to cross the Jordan, the priests carrying the Ark of the Covenant went ahead of them. Now, the Jordan is at flood stage, all during harvest. Yet as soon as the priests were carried, the arks reached the Jordan and their feet touched the water's edge. The water from upstream stopped flowing, and it piled up in a heap a great distance away at a town called Adam. The people crossed over opposite of Jericho. And the priests who carried the Ark of the Covenant of the Lord stopped in the middle of the Jordan and stood on dry ground while all Israel passed by until the whole nation had completed the crossing on dry ground. Now, consider this. This story, we can just go right by it. Oh yeah, they had to get across the river. God made a way. Kumbaya, right? It's actually not what happened. Because when you look on the map and you see where Jericho is, you can see it down at the bottom, right? They crossed right at Abel Shittim, right where Jericho is right there. And the water stopped at Adam, which is almost 40 miles away. Okay, so 40 miles, further than Columbia, is where the water stopped. So about 40 miles of river had to cross across their feet before they ever saw the result of what God had done. They had to literally stand with cold feet as the water passed over them, waiting for God's work to be seen. I think of this story because oftentimes when I'm in this moment, when I'm at this unraveling of my life in 2008, and there's this piece that doesn't make sense. I'm losing my job. My wife's losing her job. We're losing our family. We're losing our identity. We're losing our friends, our community. It's all gone. It doesn't make sense why I would feel a sense of peace, but it was there. And the verse, Psalms 37:4 says, "Take delight in the Lord, and he will give you the desires of your heart." This verse doesn't promise that he will give us everything we want. I mean, I'd like a really nice house, or I'd like a Lamborghini, or no, that's not what he's talking about. He's saying that when you delight yourself in the Lord, he is actually going to give you the new desires. He's going to transplant your heart. Suddenly, your desires will be his desires. What you want will be what he wants. And this is ultimately the result of our prayer, a way of downloading from the cloud of God what he wants for our life. And if I had just done what I wanted to do, and done what I felt like doing, and done what was convenient, or reacted harshly, or retaliated, or any of those kinds of things, I may have never seen ultimately the story that God was unfolding in my life. So remember that date, December 26, 2008, where we head to the mountains? That was the day my daughter was born. 4 years later, she would come into our home, and we would adopt her. And I tell her this often. I tell her, I say, "Alea, in the midst of my greatest pain, God birthed my greatest joy." It doesn't always work out that way, perfectly neat in a nice little bow. But I do know that following Jesus and listening to his voice is the only thing that got me through that moment. Is some kind of reassurance that he was a part of what was happening. And if he could have never possibly downloaded to me the people I would meet in this congregation, being a part of Central Church, the people that I would meet on the path of planting the church, my daughter coming into our life, all of these stops that happened along the way is God's weaving of his purpose and his plan into our life. And so here I sit again, with also tears, grieving. This is hard to leave Central. This has been a place for me where I have had a chance to grow, where I have built real relationships and friendships. But I trust where God is leading me, and I trust where God is leading Central. Because as we know, all things work together for good to those who love him and who are being called according to his purpose. What this means is that we don't react to feeling. We don't react to circumstance. We don't react to fear, but we plant our feet firmly on the belief on who God is and that he sees us and that we're not alone. I mean, in my previous tradition, I was always taught that God's love was like an umbrella, and if you get under it, he's protecting you and he loves you. And ultimately, I've learned to dispel that belief, because the most powerful moments in my life is where God is present with me is when I'm not doing the right thing. That he is with me always. So the worship team is going to come forward, and we're going to create a moment for listening. I mean, it feels weird to have a sermon and then not listen, right? So we're going to create a moment. It won't be long. But I want in this moment where the music is playing and then eventually they'll start singing. And if you want to stand at that point, you can. If you want to sit, just you do you, okay? But I want you to listen for God's voice in your life and in your heart and think about where he might be leading you. Maybe he's calling you down the path of forgiveness towards someone. Maybe he's calling you into starting something bold and courageous that you've been hesitant on. Maybe he's calling you to leave a job. Maybe he's calling you to volunteer somewhere or to engage in a relationship somewhere and invest in someone. Maybe he's calling you to let go of control. You know what God's voice is in your head. You know what he's been speaking to you. Let's take a moment and pause and listen to that. And in that moment where you hear his voice, let's surrender. Because he has more in plan for us than we can ever imagine.